Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching my weekly show, the Base Politics Podcast. It has been almost 2 decades since Scott Peterson was arrested and charged for the murder of his wife Laci and their unborn son Connor. He was ultimately given a death sentence in that case, but while public perception was overwhelmingly against him at the time of the trial, new evidence has been coming to light over the past 20-ish years that are leading many to question his guilt.
We are on the record in the matter of the People versus Scott Lee Peterson.
Tonight, convicted murderer Scott Peterson is back in court. He's fighting for a new trial in the killings of his wife and unborn child more than 20 years ago. The LA Innocence Project taking up his case, arguing new evidence shows Peterson was not behind the killings.
The LA Innocence Project certainly brings a fair amount of credibility to Scott Peterson, which wouldn't have existed prior. When they do take on a case, they tend to do it if they think there is a real possibility that they could be successful.
Peterson appearing virtually from prison for the procedural hearing on sealing the names of some witnesses. Last month, his lawyers arguing evidence previously overlooked be made available. They say it should have been presented to Peterson's original defense team.
Mr. Peterson has been waiting 20 years to find some of these police reports and audio recordings and video recordings that should have been provided.
Peterson was convicted in the 2002 murders of his wife, Laci Peterson, and their unborn child. Now, Peterson is serving a life sentence without parole. This after his original death sentence was overturned by California's Supreme Court.
Absolutely, Your Honor. Thank you.
But the LA Innocence Project now says that overlooked evidence may show Laci's killers were burglars who had broken into a house across the street. They also want to do new testing on a burned out orange van containing a bloody mattress that they say may have Laci's DNA on it. It was reportedly found in Modesto the morning after Laci vanished. John Bueller, a former police detective who led the original investigation, says he didn't know about the mattress, but is skeptical it's related to the murders.
I guess there's a possibility, but I think it's kind of like the possibility of the sun rising in the west tomorrow. I just really don't think it's there.
Peterson now facing an uphill battle to earn a new trial as questions remain over whether new evidence will be enough to set him free.
The likelihood is very small that Scott Peterson will be granted a new trial out of this. The bar is extremely high. It's not just if there was evidence that was excluded from the trial. It's if that evidence, when discovered, would likely return a different verdict.
Now, I've spent a good bit of time working in criminal justice reform and also around litigation. So for me, many of these questions around his guilt are not new. They have been circling around these communities for many, many years. But thanks to 2 new documentaries, one which is out on Netflix and one which is out on Peacock, it seems like the general public is being confronted with many of these issues for the first time, and it has thrust this case back into the national spotlight. Now, it's worth knowing that over the past 20 years, issues with Scott's trial have actually already led to his death sentence being commuted to life in prison without parole instead.
In what many are calling a stunning ruling, Scott Peterson, who was sitting on death row, just secured a huge legal victory. The California Supreme Court reversed his death penalty conviction from 2004, clearing the way for prosecutors to seek the death penalty once again in this high-profile case.
This is certainly a stake through Laci Peterson's family's heart.
A shocking move by California's highest court, a decision by Justice Leandra Kruger to reverse the death sentence handed down to convicted murderer Scott Peterson in the 2002 killing of his wife Laci and their unborn son. Detailed in the court ruling during jury selection that the trial judge, quote, made a series of clear and significant errors in jury selection that, under longstanding United States Supreme Court precedent, undermined Peterson's right to an impartial jury at the penalty phase.
What the Supreme Court said is by excluding those jurors, you tipped the scale in favor of the prosecution, and that you cannot do this.
Also included in the court ruling, Peterson's believes that he was never given a fair trial due to the unprecedented pretrial publicity in this high-profile case, an argument the court rejected, writing his guilty verdict will remain in place. The automatic appeal was initially filed with the Supreme Court back in 2012.
Scott Peterson is still guilty. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. However, the question is now, whether the prosecutor is going to go back and retry him on the death penalty phase of the case.
But now the Innocence Project has apparently joined his defense, and you guys, this is a really, really big deal. The Innocence Project is a pro bono legal defense group that is infamous for its ability to overturn wrongful convictions, particularly those on death row, which can be very, very difficult to work through the system, even when there is overwhelming evidence of innocence for a defendant. It's really, really tough to get them to work on your case. Obviously, they get tons and tons of petitions from various defendants trying to get their help. And so they have to be very picky about which cases they take on. And in my experience, they only take on cases where there is very, very significant evidence of innocence, and they feel very confident that they can be successful in overturning a verdict. So how airtight is Scott's conviction? Is it an example of a terrible husband getting the fate that he deserves, or is it yet another instance of our frequently overzealous justice system being very hasty to tie up a high-profile case and getting it wrong? We're going to discuss all of that today, but before we dig into it, make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode. Okay, let's jump into the actual case. I personally remember watching Nancy Grace pretty much every evening from the time Laci went missing to the time that Scott was charged and ultimately convicted in this trial. I, like many people in the country, was like, I had this fully on at all times. I was very enthralled by the case. I could not look away. But one thing that's been surprising to me is that as these documentaries have come out, there seems to be a lot of people who either don't remember it at all or who were too young at the time to have actually been paying attention. So for that reason, I'll give a quick summary and refresher on exactly what happened. So Laci Peterson was 26 years old. She was married to Scott. They've been married for a few years. They lived in California, and she was 8 months pregnant when she went missing on December 24th, Christmas Eve of 2002. Now, her case blew up in a way that is not really that common for cases to blow up, and I think a lot of that had to do with the timing of it. Obviously, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day are pretty dead zones for the media. There's not a lot of news coming out. And so when she went missing, she had a person in her family that had done some PR work. They sent out a press release and it just landed. The house was encircled within a few days by the press. We saw something similar happen actually when JonBenet Ramsey went missing as well. This just seems to be like a dead zone where there's plenty of capacity for the media to focus on a missing person. Now, Scott was identified as a person of interest almost immediately by both the police and the public. Many people thought that he was not acting sad enough. He seemed very calm and nonchalant. A lot of her friends and family were trying to do a lot of media to keep attention on the case, but he really didn't seem to be cooperating as much. He didn't want to take media interviews. He didn't want to take a polygraph test. And so people were already sort of looking at him out of their side eye, but then a bombshell broke. On January 24th of 2003, which was a little over a month after Laci initially disappeared, the public learned that Scott had had a mistress the entire time.
I met Scott Peterson November 20th, 2002. We did have a romantic relationship.
The mistress's name was Amber Fry, and she had begun working with police to basically build a case against Scott. They had taped, I think, close to 30 hours of their phone conversations without him knowing by the time the public found out about her presence in his life. And then we started learning even sketchier stuff around the circumstances of Laci's disappearance. For example, Amber Fry said that on December 9th of 2002, which was just a few weeks before Laci went missing, she had been told by a friend that Scott was actually married. And so she confronted him about that. And during this confrontation, he lied to her and told her that his wife had actually recently died and that this was going to be his first holiday season without her. That's bad enough as it is. But then it comes out that Scott had also bought a boat that same day, December 9th of 2002, a boat that nobody in his family or Laci's family knew anything about. And it just so happens that his alibi for the time that Laci goes missing on December 24th is that he is, you guessed it, fishing. So all in all, the facts seem pretty damning in this case. It's worth knowing that pregnant women are actually 16% more likely to die by homicide, which is so gross and so sad. And not only are they more likely to die by homicide, those homicides are directly linked to domestic and partner abuse. Secondarily, Scott obviously had a motive in this case. He had a girlfriend who did not know he was married, who he very much seemed interested in continuing a relationship with and even furthering that relationship. And he just had this little inconvenient problem that he had a wife and a baby on the way. Thirdly, when Laci and Connor's bodies were found later that spring, they happened to wash up in the exact area of the bay where Scott said he had been fishing on the day she disappeared. Now, obviously, both of these documentaries cover these facts. And so I've been watching the reaction of people online to those who have questions about Scott's innocence. And a lot of people are really mad that anybody would dare argue there might be a chance this guy didn't do it.
People who genuinely believe that Laci Peterson was not unalived by her husband Scott, like, stop. Because these are the same people, if you made a Venn diagram of those people and people who think they're going to get sex trafficked out of a Target parking lot, it would almost be a circle, I would say. Like, there is no boogeyman, okay? There was no, it was her husband! Like, yeah. And I sometimes, like, you know, things aren't always as they seem, and sometimes they are. And sometimes it is that simple. And then people say, well, just because you cheat doesn't... No, you're right. You're right. It's actually all the other things that this man did that make it so clearly obvious that he offed her and his unborn child. That is why he was proven in a court to be guilty and why he is guilty. So, just watching this documentary, and, like, there's still people... I've seen TikToks of people trying to say, like, he didn't do it. He did. It's really that simple.
This girl's sentiment is actually exactly what a lot of people thought at the time. Nancy Grace especially had everybody whipped up into a fever pitch per usual. Like, the inability for the public or police or prosecutors to even consider that somebody else might be guilty was simply just not on the table. But the reality is, people have thought these exact same things about a whole lot of people throughout history who ended up being innocent. Like I said, I've spent years working in criminal justice reform. I've worked around people who are guilty. I've worked around people who are innocent. I've overturned the death penalty in 3 states. So I am intimately familiar with these kinds of cases and how easy it is for somebody to look really guilty and actually be innocent, and also how hard it is to prove that innocence in a system once police and prosecutors and the public believe that you did it. First and foremost, when it comes to Scott's behavior, I want to say for all cases, but especially in this one, it drives me nuts when people determine guilt or innocence based on how a person acts. We hear this over and over and over in the criminal justice system, where people are not properly demonstrating their emotions or their grief in a way that the public expects them to. But first and foremost, I would say that you have no idea how you would behave or act in that situation, and I hope you never have to find out how you would behave. People are different. They grieve differently. They show their emotions differently. They process differently. And I would say, if anything, oftentimes people who are very performative with their grief are a little bit more suspicious. If somebody's innocent and they don't really have much to hide, then they're not going to show up looking guilty or super bereaved because they are still hopeful that person is alive and they're not trying to put on an act. Secondarily, Scott being unwilling to go in the media or cooperate with police is not a problem in my book. First and foremost, not everybody is good at media. And I would actually say the vast majority of people should not be thrust into media in these situations. You need to pick those who are actually capable of performing in those situations and let them handle that.
There's a lot of questions on why I have not been in the media. Media will put, I believe, the emotional stuff out there for a couple days, and then the story will get dropped for something else. It was our thoughts that if I was to hold back from the media would continue to come because, frankly, cameras, reporters, they want something they can't get right away.
When it comes to police, I would tell absolutely anybody who is encountering police and who might be a suspect or who they want to question to know your rights and utilize them. Because guess what? Police often lie. They often frame people. They often wrongfully convict people and build cases against them. So if you're going in there a little eager beaver and just wanting to help them and do your best, they are going to take advantage of you. In no way, shape, or form should you ever agree to talk to police without a lawyer, and probably without some kind of deal in place if you can get it through that lawyer. You certainly should not be taking polygraph tests, first and foremost, because they're not scientific, okay? They're actual junk. I'm pretty sure they're not even allowed in most courts as evidence anymore. And because, once again, they can skew those results. So no, he was totally smart and within his rights to not play their game. And honestly, when you really dig into the merits of this case, it is pretty shocking to believe they were able to send somebody to death row with the evidence that they had. And that's because the only evidence they had in the case was what we call circumstantial evidence. There was nothing hard for them to hang their hat on. And circumstantial evidence is, again, easily influenced by police, their perceptions, the prosecutors, and the general public. And you're going to see that as I comb through this case and we talk about the issues with the prosecution's timeline, as well as the lack of interest in potential alternate culprits that were present at the time. In this case, you have no eyewitnesses. You have no crime scene. They can't even plausibly say where or how she was murdered. You have no confession, and you have no solid DNA, which I think the public and juries tend to be overly reliant on DNA to begin with. It's not nearly as infallible as shows like CSI or Law & Order would make you believe. Oftentimes, it is used incorrectly and can lead to wrongful convictions, and it's not even all that available. We only have it in about 10% of cases. But it can be a good tool to eliminate certain people or to help prosecutors and police have a better understanding of what actually took place in a crime. But in this one, it really doesn't exist. The only thing they have is a hair wrapped around some pliers at his shed where he kept his boat that may or may not have been Laci's. Furthermore, even the circumstantial evidence that they do have against Scott and in which they use to prosecute and ultimately convict him, it's shaky at best. I think there is this belief in the general public that the vast majority of people in prison maintain their innocence, right? That they'll never cop to what they did. But that's actually not true. So I want to point one big problem I have out with this case, which is the fact that Scott has always maintained his innocence for almost 20 years. That is not nothing. It's actually really, really rare for somebody to maintain their innocence at all, much less for that long in the system. And that's because pretty much everything is stacked against you as a defendant and incentivizes you confessing to a crime, even if you did not ultimately commit it. Thanks to coercive police tactics, the tremendous role that plea bargains play in our system. I'm talking 95 to 99% of cases, depending on whether or not you're looking at the state or federal level, are pled out. And so if you are being looked at and they think you might be guilty and they say, hey, we're going to charge you and try to get the death penalty unless you confess, most people actually will go ahead and confess even if they are innocent because they don't want to take a chance of getting a death sentence, and they can reduce the sentence to something less by confessing. Scott didn't do that. You also have things like cash money bail, which is a really corrupt system where basically we say once you are being charged with a crime, you have to either have enough money to pay to be on release until your trial date, or you're going to sit here, lose your job, probably lose your house because you can't make payments awaiting your trial. And so many people, when they can't afford bail, will go ahead and falsely confess, again, to get the whole thing over with more quickly. And all of this contributes to the fact that a lot of wrongful convictions actually trace back to false confessions. The Innocence Project actually reports that false confessions or admissions have played a role in approximately 29% of their DNA exoneration cases. And the National Registry on Exonerations has found that among all types of exoneration cases, about 12% involve false confessions. So it's actually far more likely that somebody would falsely confess to a crime than it is that they would maintain their innocence for a very long time period and risk such harsh penalties. I do want to circle back to the Innocence Project and some of their work, because the reason I had so much overlap with them was due to my time working on the death penalty, where one of the main arguments I had against it was the frequency in which we sent innocent people to death row. In fact, for every 8 people that the United States has executed since the 1970s, one person has been exonerated from death row. That is a terrifying statistic that honestly should make everybody back off this kind of penalty. The government cannot deliver the mail correctly. You think that they are not making massive mistakes in the criminal justice system? They definitely are. And somebody's life should not be on the line when the system is this corrupt. And what you find when you start combing into some of these exonerations is not only do you have false confessions, not only do you have a lot of problems with DNA evidence and very, very corrupt practices around how they are presenting it to juries. You also have a lot of evidence getting thrown out. You have Brady violations galore, which is when prosecutors do not follow the law and actually turn over the evidence that they have to the defense team. You have eyewitnesses making wrongful identifications. You have prosecutors buddying up with jailhouse informants in order to get testimony against somebody, which often proves to be incorrect, but that person gets a reduced sentence. So why would they not lie on this person? And ultimately, when you really start digging into some of the cases of people on death row, you will be shocked at the amounts of evidence that didn't get tested in the first place. You will be shocked at the fact that you have actual witnesses that can come out and provide alibis or actually like push back on key components of the prosecution's arguments. And you would think that when those things come up that you would just go before a judge and be like, hey, we've got substantial evidence this person might be innocent. And they would be like, ooh, you know, we better check that thoroughly and make sure before we execute this person. No, that's not what happens. In fact, you need a lot of money and really, really good attorneys just to get some of this evidence before a judge and have them look at it. That's not what's happening in the appeals process. The appeals process is just looking and combing through the methods that the lawyers used and making sure that everything was by the book. They're not looking to see, like, is there other evidence this person might be innocent? So in the Scott Peterson case, the Innocence Project has fortunately come to his defense, and they are really, really good, and they are filling the role that many people cannot afford, which is of a high-profile defense attorney who is actually going to know how to game the system to get this kind of evidence before a judge and have it reconsidered. And in the Laci Peterson case, there seems to be a lot that was not considered. The Innocence Project has actually asked to have a bloody mattress that was found in a burned van in the Modesto, California area the morning after Laci disappeared tested.
I know what you're thinking. I thought we've been through this, and you're partially right there. There was further testing done in this case in 2013 and 2019, and Peterson was denied a new murder trial in 2022. Now, though, a group that helps exonerate the wrongfully convicted is involved in this case. This 89-page motion has been filed on behalf of convicted murderer Scott Peterson by the Los Angeles Innocence Project. The motion is in response to Stanislaus County prosecutors who argued just 2 weeks ago that there is no need for additional DNA testing relating to the murder of Peterson's wife Laci and unborn baby Connor 20-plus years later.
This is going to be a tough call for the judge because this is a case that there is a lot of evidence against Scott Peterson, but at the same time, you want to make sure you get this right.
That's legal analyst Stephen Clark, who has closely followed the Peterson case for many years. At the very least, the LA Innocence Project would like items from this burned-out van tested with state-of-the-art DNA detection, including the testing of not a sample, but the entire bloodied mattress, which was found inside the van. The burnt van was found near the Peterson home the morning after Laci's disappearance.
That seems like a pretty significant thing that you should probably test in a case like this. They also say that there was a strip of duct tape stuck to Laci's pants when she was found, and this is another piece of evidence that could have significant DNA on it that did not get tested initially. And this is really interesting to me because not only do you have actual pieces of evidence that could point to other culprits in the case, you also have significant issues with the entire timeline and picture the prosecution painted, and many of the holes that they did not stuff during the course of their investigation could trace back to alternate theories that might line up with this evidence. So first, let's talk about the timeline issues in Laci's disappearance. So Scott's story is that he and Laci woke up the morning of Christmas Eve. They spent some time together. She was watching some TV. She was getting ready to do some cleaning, and he left around 10 a.m. Now, according to the prosecution, this lines up. They say they can trace his cell phone and that he did leave the house around that time. He then went to his work shed. He got his boat, and then he drove about 90 miles to the bay to go fishing. And he did not head back home until around 2 p.m. when he called Laci's phone and left a voicemail. So according to them, Laci had to be dead by 10 a.m. in order for this to work, in order for him to then leave, drive her body to the boat, put it in the boat, drive the boat to the bay, dump it, and head back home around 2 p.m. But the problem with all of this is that there are multiple witnesses who claim to have seen Laci after 10 a.m. that day. witnesses that police refused to follow up with in many circumstances. Because these things did not come up during the course of Scott's trial, his family ultimately ended up hiring a private investigator to further research the matter. And he found several people who claimed to have seen a very pregnant woman who fit Laci's description with a dog that also fit Laci's dog description out running and or walking with her dog in the area after 10 a.m. 2 of those witnesses actually appear in the Peacock documentary. The second issue with their very circumstantial evidence has to do with potential alternative culprits. Now, according to the prosecution and police, there simply was nobody else, right? They say that she was an introvert, she mostly kept to herself, she stayed home, Scott was pretty much her whole world, so it's very, very unlikely anybody else could have killed her. However, numerous people have brought up the presence of a robbery that occurred on her street during the same time period during which she went missing. Now, police tried to write off this robbery. They identified 2 suspects who did not match the description of other witnesses in the area who claimed to have robbed her neighbor's house on December 26th, 2 days after Laci went missing. But there's a lot of problems with that. One, why are we taking the word of burglars on what day they were at a house or were not at a house? Secondarily, by December 26th, Laci and Scott's house was circled with media. There was media all up and down that street. So you don't think any of the media there would have caught a robbery going down right across the street? Be so serious.
So the house straight across the street from Scott and Laci was burglarized, and their last name was Medina. They'd left home Christmas Eve morning, December 24th at about 10:30 in the morning. They came back home on December 26th at about 4:15 in the afternoon. When they arrived back home in Modesto, they knew something was going on. There were national media trucks downtown by the police station because Laci had been reported missing. Upon entering their home, they immediately realized their house had been burglarized. The side door had been kicked in. We thought, maybe it had some connection to what happened to Laci, and, all of us were very hopeful it might give us some leads or some indication as to what happened. I think about a week or so went by, and the police announced that they'd caught the 2 men who burglarized the home. But that those 2 men burglarized the home on the 26th. And as a family, we just kind of believed that they'd done their due diligence in investigating that burglary. But, you fast forward to 15 years later, and the evidence shows that the burglary actually happened on December 24th, on the day that Laci went missing. But the judge circled back to that time that the next door neighbor put the dog back of 10:18 and said, whatever happened to Laci happened before 10:18. They didn't go on vacation until 10:30, so the burglary is completely unrelated to Laci's disappearance. Therefore, we are sentencing Scott to death and sending him to San Quentin.
Secondarily, the robbers the police trotted out and started working with to discount this potential other story of what might have happened to Laci, which I just think is so weird. Why are you working with the burglars who you should be grilling? But these robbers, according to the police, used a car, and that also does not match the description of the robbery people claimed to have seen going down on December 24th. And witnesses who claimed to have seen this robbery going down said that they saw the culprits using a van, as well as one witness claiming she saw some men pushing a pregnant woman into a van on that day. And they actually bring up some of this to Scott in the Peacock documentary, which contains interviews with him from prison. And in it, he says he believes that police actually withheld potentially exculpatory evidence that could have exonerated him during this time, which is illegal. But I'm telling you, police and prosecutors do this all the time. The amount of misconduct in trials, especially by prosecutors, is unreal. But because you have qualified immunity for police and pretty much absolute immunity for prosecutors, literally nothing happens. I bring all of this up in today's episode not because I am here to argue for Scott's innocence, but because I am here to argue that the safeguards our founders tried to institute within our justice system be stringently upheld. And I'm here to remind you just how often the police are wrong. I'm here to remind you how little accountability there is for prosecutors and police. And I'm here to tell you how hard it is to get a wrongful conviction overturned. And because of all of these things, every single person in this country ought to err on the side of the defendant. This is why I've argued for the death penalty to be abolished. I think it's reckless. I think it's a huge waste, and I think it kills innocent people. And unfortunately, what we see happen in society is people are often, I think justifiably, very angry over injustices like Laci and Connor's death. But because of that, they lead with their emotion, and they are very quick to trust prosecutors and police when they should not be. They're very quick to stop caring about things like due process, and they often want very, very punitive reactions for people. But this getting swept up with emotions, joining the mob, it leads to really terrible outcomes. And unfortunately, it seems that a lot of people really don't start caring about that downside until they or someone in their family are impacted by this sort of thing. There is an old notion in our society that I continue to adhere to that says I would rather see 1,000 guilty men go free than one innocent person perish. When there is this level of problems with a case, especially one where somebody is having their life taken from them by the government, the burden really does need to be on the state to overwhelmingly prove their case. That's why it's supposed to be beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt. And you cannot tell me if you sat on that jury or even if you watched these documentaries that you could sentence this person beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt. And that's unfortunate because honestly, probably Scott did do it. That's still probably the likelihood. But the fact that the state didn't do its job, didn't actually pursue alternate theories, didn't actually test evidence, didn't make their case lock tight, that is their problem. And they have to be able to do that in order to take away people's freedoms and their lives permanently. All right, guys, I hope you liked this episode. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. If you want even more content from me, head over to Twitter, TikTok, or Instagram.
Yeah.